Hi, everyone, and welcome to another book discussion as part of our Black Lives Matter series. This evening, we are discussing a novel called The Street. This is by Anne Petry. It was written in 1946. And before we get started, maybe we can quickly introduce ourselves. I am Lucy. I work in the youth department. I do youth and adult programming and like to talk about books.
Hi, I'm Jacob. I am an AADL employee in the outreach department. And I think one of my favorite parts of working here is doing this stuff with you guys. So I'm really excited.
My name's Marissa. I also work in the outreach department with Jacob.
My name is Elizabeth. I am a librarian at AADL in both the collections department, and then I also work a lot with youth and adult programming. So yeah, happy to be here.
I'm Amanda. I also work in the youth department. I'm a library technician, and I do a variety of programming for all ages. And one of my favorite things also is to take part in these book discussions, and I'm excited to discuss today's book with everybody.
Great. Yeah, I think like with this book, there are a lot of different ways we could go with this discussion, like broad strokes are very specific. But before we get into that, maybe I'll just give a little overview about Anne Petry and the book. So she was born in 1908 and she was one of few Black families that lived in like a middle-class town in Connecticut in Old Saybrook. And she became a pharmacist. She followed in her father's footsteps. And then in 1938, she got married and moved to Harlem with her husband. She was a journalist there, and this is the first book that she wrote. She'd written some articles and some short stories, but this was her first novel. And though she's not from Harlem, this book is entirely set in Harlem. When it was published to huge acclaim, and she was the first African-American woman to sell over 1 million copies of a book. So this book just took off. And then she wrote 2 other novels that didn't have the same amount of success. She moved back to Connecticut. She wasn't really comfortable being a celebrity. She kind of felt like there was a little piece of her that was being owned by everybody who was, approaching her as part of that celebrity. And she felt it turned into her into public property. So she moved back to Connecticut and wrote 2 more books, but nothing had the success of this. I think it's interesting because this book like sort of dropped off the radar for a bit. I don't know how familiar you guys were with it. And that's kind of a good place to start, I guess, is to say, is this a book that you were familiar with? And what were your reactions to it?
Well, I had not heard of it. I always feel bad admitting that in these discussions because I do purchase the adult fiction collection. Luckily, we did have copies, but I hadn't heard of it, and so I was interested in reading it. I am always excited when there's something like this that comes up because I really love reading some of these classics from, the earlier 1900s, and I guess I don't know how much we're getting into things. I thought, I kind of imagined it as a bit of a protest novel against segregation and against, how Black folks were forced to live, earlier in the 1900s. And I also thought it was really sad and found myself pretty depressed during reading it. So just kind of my opening feelings, and I know we're going to get into stuff more later too, but I thought it was excellent, but certainly not an uplifting read, and for good reason. So, yeah.
And to add what you had said, it is absolutely a issues book. But it's also entertaining. I was so shocked to find out that it was actually, I call this a thriller? I was shocked to find out that a book from that time period, which says more about me as a reader than anything, moved so fast. And I think one of my favorite sorts of experiences is when it comes to reading or art or film or what have you, is when something addresses the world at large while still entertaining. I think people put so little value on being entertained or compelled by the plot. And I'm just like, well, I'm a person too. I, you know? So that's something that I really loved about reading this book.
I had a similar experience. I also had not heard of this book before. And when I first started reading it, I was not into it. The writing style kind of put me off. And I didn't understand there was such detail into some of the sentences and the surroundings at the beginning. But then once I started getting more into the book, I wouldn't call it a thriller, but it's that same effect of like, I didn't want to put it down because I was just so engrossed in like, well, what's going to happen next? And then once you started getting more points of views from other characters, also told in a similar writing style, it was so captivating. And I didn't want to stop reading. I wanted to see where it was going to go. I was so worried about what the outcome for her was going to be. And in what way would she go further down that hole? And there were so many ways she could have. And even the way it did happen, I didn't pick that one. And I was like, wait, but that's not one of my guesses. So it was just interesting to follow it. And I was really glad to read this book, and it did move fairly quickly. The copy I had, the pages were kind of aligned weird, but it's a big thick book, and I thought, oh dear, big thick book, I'm not into it. But then I couldn't put it down. So I like your use of the word thriller there, Jacob.
Sounds like none of us had heard of this really when we started. I also had not heard of this or in Petry, and I admit I was dragging my feet a little bit to start reading it just because it's not my chosen genre or era. And this actually kind of ended up being my favorite book that we've read for the series, I think. I really loved this book a lot. And I was really struck by how, even though this was written so long ago, it could have been written like yesterday. Like it still felt very modern and very present. And yeah, I also, Jacob and I had kind of talked about this earlier, just like a thriller and like on the edge of our seats of like what's going to happen, and just the anxiety that I had reading this book really was a lot more than I was expecting.
Yeah, but part of it too was the anxiety of the expectation or anticipating what's coming next, but also it is depressing and dark and it's heartbreaking at the same time. So the juxtaposition of those two emotions of like feeling so like just disgusted and sad about what you're reading, but also like anticipating whatever horrible thing's going to happen next. It was a very interesting the way the author was able to put all of those things together. It was so well done, but there's so many just gut wrenching because you're waiting for terrible things to happen to these people. That's what you're anticipating and waiting to see what's around the corners. You're just waiting to see what other terrible thing will enter their lives that they don't deserve.
Yeah, there's a big sense of just like foreboding. Is that how you say that? Like throughout the whole book, I felt like, because I kind of never really had hope that things were going to work out, which was hard for me. I mean, I understand why, like I understand the point of Anne writing this book and all that, but you know, like Amanda said, there's kind of this sense of dread that winds its way through the whole book, and like what's going to happen next, and what is this, you know, what bad unfair thing is going to happen to this character. And so, but you know, you are left very curious and wanting to read quickly to find out. So yeah.
Yeah, one thing I wanted to address about the thriller thing that you brought up, and Marissa, Jacob and Marissa, you were agreeing with, is it's really interesting if you go back and look at all of the covers of this book since it was published in 1946, and they tried to sell it as everything. Like it was kind of a pulpy cover. There's definitely like a thriller cover. There's definitely this mom and son. You know, it's just so all these different ways that they tried to bill it. Because I don't really know if it can be shoved into one genre. Like it definitely is thrilling in the sense that you're captivated and you can't put it down. But I also think, like, I know that Anne Petry believed hugely in the novel as social commentary. Like she kind of believed that was the only way for fiction to exist. And I think that you really see that here. And it's like, it's hard to read, as you are all saying, because it's hard to have hope. But I think that like that's such a huge point of it, is that there's no way out of the cycle, you know, that there's so many things. And that's actually leads me to another question about, I mean, I have a lot of questions, but one is that like, I think Ludi, the main character, you know, she experiences like racism, sexism. She experiences poverty throughout her whole life. And I don't know if any of you in reading this felt like either you as a reader felt like one of those was more oppressive, or you felt like Ludi felt like one of those was more oppressive. I don't know.
I feel like for her, I feel like her financial situation weighed on her more than some of the other things. And that sort of spread itself throughout the book and talking about money and turning off the lights. So she kind of instilled that in her son, like, don't turn the lights on even if you're afraid because we have to pay more money. And that ends up getting him in trouble. Is that, for me, I focus more on just the poverty and how she was forced to live in this place. Even though it was because she was Black and they had no money and this is where they were all living. But she still, the root of it is she was just because they were poor, and all of the other, there were other couple of things at the end of it, at the end of the book I was just reading earlier. And the basic thing was is when they were sitting in, after her son was put in, he was taken away by the officers, and she was waiting in that hallway with the other people, and she was looking around and she was noticing that they were all Black. They're all sitting there sad and Black and hunched over. And there were a couple of white women, but they were speaking non-English. And then she noticed, she was like, oh, what we all have in common is we're all poor. We're all poor. And so for me, that really set.
This is definitely one of those books that existed before we had the word intersectionality, but like to me, this book was just like a pancake stack of everything against her, which was just so powerful. Of like, there's moments where she has these like class consciousness of like, maybe being poor is, maybe I do have things in common with poor white people. And then she's talking about how like the system is also oppressing men and like Black men, but then she's still being oppressed as a woman by these Black men and by white men. And it's just like all of these things are against her. And like, she calls it the bricks that are just like being stacked up, walling her up. And I just like, it's such a visceral way to think about all of those things working against you. And you're really just fully trapped every way that you go.
I thought it was amazing the way in which she laid out how the system works in such a succinct way. It was amazing. I really thought to myself, I could hand this to somebody like my grandpa, and he could walk away thinking, I see how there's a system in place that oppresses Black people in hundreds of different small ways, and the oppressions that exist within that. And I was like, what a powerful thing to have.
Yeah, I felt like that was Anne Petry's like journalism background coming through a bit. Like I felt like she was like really almost, it felt like kind of like reporting on a story that could have been very real, you know? And it felt like, you know, she was expressing the facts of that system that Jacob mentioned, you know, and like laying them out for readers very clearly as a journalist might want to, you know. I thought of that throughout the book. So I agree with you, Jacob.
Yeah, I think like it's so hard to parse out like if there was any one piece of anything that was oppressing her more than anything. But I was so struck by the like the constant ire that people feel towards her because of her beauty, and like the ownership that men feel they have over her because of her beauty, and almost like how angry they are when they can't possess her because of her beauty. Women hate her because of her beauty, and it just seems like that her beauty is portrayed as such a negative thing for her. Like it doesn't help her really in any way. I think it allows people, it gives people this license to like feel that it's okay to treat her the way that they do. And that just struck me because I think a lot of times you read books and for women, their beauty is either like, it's the source of their evil, like they're this sorceress, or it's something that helps them get ahead a lot, you know? And it was just really, I felt like it was just constantly brought up. Everybody who meets her observes how beautiful she is. And that instantly turns into something where men just feel like they can do what they want with her and own a piece of her. And that's all she is. And I just, I don't know, that just really stood out to me. And not any more than the poverty piece or the race piece. And I don't think that like Ann Petry or Ludi, the character, lets any of it stay, like doesn't let you forget about any of those pieces, because Ludi in her mind so much keeps, like so much of this book is in her mind, you know, about these like cyclical thoughts about like, well, it was this that led to this, that led back to this. So I just think but that was just one thing that I was just, I don't know, made me angry at everybody. Like was so angry at her for being beautiful, you know. So.
Yeah, Lucy, just to comment on that, I was thinking that like such a big theme of this book to me was like confinement, and how Ludi feels so confined, like both by her poverty, by her beauty, by racism, but also by her cramped apartment, you know, by the crowds she talks about on the streets, by on the bus or the whatever it is, maybe it was this, I can't remember, the transportation. It's like crowd. She always just feels so like trapped and confined. And I think all of the aspects come together to kind of equally in different ways, like trap her, you know, and confine her, including the beauty and the poverty and all that. And I just like, even the way Petry writes, like there's so many sentences about like the things being tight or like hot or like all of that, you know, and I just felt like that was ongoing throughout the book. So just wanted to get that comment in.
In that feeling of confinement, I recall on descriptions of sometimes she's going down the hall like normal, and sometimes the hall's caving in on her. And sometimes she's just going up the stairs, and sometimes she can't even lift her leg up to get to the next stair because she feels like it's narrowing and narrowing. And that sense of confinement, oof, this book might actually even have elements of horror. That sense of foreboding and dread. Miss Min goes and casts a spell on somebody. That first scene when she's in that dark room with him, that was some Hitchcock stuff.
Yeah, totally.
The scene in which Mrs. Hedges is on fire. Sorry, as a big horror nerd, I'm like, this is actually that. This is this.
Yeah.
Or
now,
at least it's fun to think about it in that lens.
No, you're right. And I also thought that. I was picturing it. I was like, is this made into a movie? Or I was visualizing it as a play in black and white. And I can see these really strong actors voicing these characters, especially the scene where Mrs. Hedges was, when she was remembering being on fire and flashing back to that, or when Ludi is in the hallway and when Jones finally gets his hands on her and then Min lets the dogs out and Jones freaks out. That was a horrible scene. And that all felt like I could see like a slow motion, black and white, like totally Hitchcock. I totally visualized the same thing, Jacob, when I was going through those scenes in my head. So.
Yeah, I think like even in the beginning when she's looking at this apartment and she has this sense that like Jones is, the way he's looking at her and the way he's portrayed in the shadows. And then you get further on and you're like, wait, she was right. She was totally right. Like that was totally what he was thinking and how he was behaving. And even the way Jones is like cast and the way that everyone views him as this, like, not like he's lived in basements for so long and he's lived in solitude for so long that he doesn't even know how to interact with people. So it's almost like he becomes monstrous, you know. But then I think it's really interesting, and I don't know how you all feel about the way that Ann Petry like worked to portray other characters in this book. Like I think that we got into a lot of people's minds, and I don't know, did it like help you to feel sympathetic towards anyone or help you to understand why they had done what they did?
Yeah, I have two thoughts about that. So I think it's interesting too how the differences between how Jones is characterized. This is like very intimate, like you have him, a chapter from his point of view. He seems like very close and physically present and dangerous in a way. And then the character of, I don't know, I was pronouncing it in my head as Junto, I don't know, Junto? That guy who's more faceless, even though he is physically described. He's also this like background character of he owns everything. He owns the nightclubs. He is like puppeteering her career because he wants to sleep with her, even though like that does kind of come in towards the end. It's sort of this like behind the scenes more, and it's strange, those two villains, how they're presented. I also think it's so interesting that a lot of Junto's white, but he's commonly described as gray, and just like his skin is gray, his clothes are gray. It just like was a really interesting characterization of him that added a lot. And then also the differences between when you were talking about Ludi's beauty and how beautiful she is, and how that in some ways really traps her. It also gives her certain opportunities, like she could become a singer. She's blocked then because Junto and the other guy was a creep, and then contrasted with Mrs. Hedges and her like grotesqueness that they really go on and on about, and her like her size, and just so then when we got to her point of view, I don't know, it's like this morally gray character of like she is doing the best she can with what she has, but is also awful. And I don't know, I thought it was very interesting how they made her such an ugly, like physically character, and described it a lot, and how then she didn't have certain chances and just really seemed to be forced into what she was.
But she had a romantic chance with Junto.
Yeah.
So what the heck was that about? Like,
But
was
she
that
also kind of had power, you know, like I mean, she was powerful, and like that's interesting that the one person who's really described as not beautiful at all is allowed to have more power. But
yeah, I think she did have power, but she also sort of had that all-seeing eye of knowing what was going on in the street and how all of these things were connected. She had her hand in all of that, so she did have power. Especially with some of the girls walking by, like she was cherry picking like young girls she could bring in and then use them so she could get money by having her have sex with random people, you know? So she did have power in her own way. But I did like reading her perspective and knowing sort of how she got to where she is. Same thing when we were in Boots's head and learning how he came, like how he got out of being in the military and how he was tired of being a porter and was scrubbing floors. And then he was in the bar that one night and then he was just playing piano. He was mad and drinking. He played the piano after 6 drinks. And that's how he sort of got his in, and he just stayed there. And eventually he had like a nice place to live and he had a pocket full of money, but he was not a good guy. But I liked hearing part of his background and where he came from and how, so I thought it was really smart and really effective the way the author gave us that glimpse into the other characters and how they got to be in the places they are.
I think even Jones, I mean, you know, he wanted to not be in a position of such solitude. I think, you know, and he went and he served in the military and he comes home and the only options for him are to be like in these jobs where he's by himself, you know, and that's like another little piece of social commentary, is this idea that we're sending these, you know, Black men off to fight and try to save this country, but then when they come back, they get nothing, you know. So yeah, I appreciated all the points of view.
Even Min,
even
on Min's point of view as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
I was taken aback the similarities between Jones and what we call today the incel, or you know, the rise of incel culture. It's this man who believes that he is incapable of connecting with women, so he has to possess them, and he has such low confidence, but he's such a narcissist. And I'm like, she is describing the many different flavors of toxic masculinity. And it felt prophetic. I was like, what kind of crystal ball does she have? But maybe things just haven't changed that much.
I was also thinking about how much she had also internalized too. Like Ludi constantly is blaming herself for her husband cheating on her, that it was somehow her fault because she was working. So her husband had no choice but to go cheat on her and sleep around. And just like how she constantly felt responsible for everybody else's choices that weren't her fault.
I mean, that's like universal too, though, right? Like that still happens today. I think it's like not just women, but I think in particular women can tend to blame themselves for like, oh, like, well, he did this because I'm difficult or like I'm anxious or like, that kind of thing. And it's like, well, no, your husband didn't cheat on you because you were working, like, So I just felt like that was kind of a universal truth that has carried on.
And Ludi understands the system as it's working in her life. And she can understand that the system is doing this to her while still blaming herself. She does both, which I thought was really interesting. I'm like, why are you so hard on yourself after you just explained to me societally why this is happening? But I think that's just human nature. You don't want to, it's much easier to blame yourself than to yell into the void of society. So you go, oh, well, if I would have done this, and that, then maybe.
Yeah, especially since Ludi felt so trapped. Like she was smart enough to understand all of these pieces and why things were happening the way they were, but she also was powerless to do anything about it to change. She tried, so if she worked hard, made money, they can get out of there, Bob could get out of the street and they would have much better lives, Other things would have been oppressing them if they moved out of that street, but she still didn't have enough power to get past it because there were all of these roadblocks that were just like blocking her in. Just all those bricks were coming up.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's like in a way where the title plays into it, even that she doesn't like. I think she finally realizes like it's not just this street, This street is the street, but it's every street that I'm gonna ever be on. And I think what's interesting, if you think about her in the beginning of the book, like she is smart about how the system works, but then she also has this idea of like, Ben Franklin did this thing and I'm gonna do this thing. And then she goes to work for the Chandlers. And I think that is all very eye-opening for her about money, but also I thought that was a really interesting part as a reader to see how things played out with their money. And then like how that was shown later, like for instance the uncle committing suicide. I don't know, she sees how that money just kind of can take care of that and rename it, and then later like the way that cops treat Black people on the street, it just like those are the moments too where you're reading and you're like, wait, when was this written? But I think it was interesting to see her go from this person who thought she could have something to this like sad realization of she couldn't get out. I don't know. That's not really a question, that's just an observation about her time with the Chandlers. I thought was particularly interesting.
And it was such it's such a common American myth, right? Of like, we could all be Ben Franklin and all work. And it's like, well, the Chandlers did it. It's like, well, they started with money. That's not necessarily a good thing, but that are an addressed issue. And then, yeah, Boots did it. He was discovered and then was living fine, where it's like kind of the same today of like people see Oprah and say like, well, Oprah did it or Beyonce did it. And really we're all trapped and it's probably not going to happen for most of us.
Yeah.
Speaking of the Chandlers,
yeah. No, go ahead. I would love you to speak of the Chandlers.
Thinking of the Chandlers, oh, geez, what was I gonna say? No, okay. So Mrs. Chandler, who basically just kind of slept around with whoever she wanted to, and just drank freely and was getting crunked up whenever she wanted to. How is that any different from Ludi's father?
It's not.
It's just that she can, because she's in her beautiful parlor. She has somebody to take care of her kid. Her husband's doing whatever her husband's doing. And I was like, it is crazy how the framing of somebody's behavior makes it acceptable or unacceptable.
Mm-hmm.
Not the behavior itself.
There's a whole great Twitter thread that I recommend anybody to Google of what is something that's classy if you're rich and trashy if you're poor. And it's basically all of those same behaviors, stuff like that, like speaking a second language, or just little things, depending on how you frame it or what color somebody is who's doing it. changes a lot.
Yeah, I think it's interesting too how Ludy's like when she's with the Chandlers, I mean, she sees all of that, you know, and she's like, I know so much about them and they know nothing about me. And I just think that that is an interesting observation. I feel like it's something that I've seen a lot in a lot of the reading that we've done, like for this series, is the idea that, you know, to be the suppressed party, like you know so much more about how the people who are oppressing you are working. People who are the oppressors don't need to know, you know, the people on the other side of it. Do you want to talk a little bit about the ending? Because like, I just want to, like, I thought Ludy's frame of mind was pretty interesting going into that. And I don't know if anyone felt like her hold on reality changed at all, or like, was there one thing that prompted her to do what she did? And I mean, obviously we're going to have spoilers here because it's hard to talk about this book, I think, as a whole without talking about that. But, or did it surprise you? I mean, I know, Amanda, you said that's not the ending you picked, so.
Well, wasn't I picked her, I honestly thought she would end up being like raped or beaten or killed or something would happen to her kid by the evil men in this book who were like verbally and physically attacking her throughout most of the book. That's where I saw it going. I didn't picture her getting her revenge. I don't know what that says about me as a reader.
I thought the same thing. I was so worried something was going to happen to her or her son.
Yeah, I was too.
I wasn't surprised by the violence. Like I just felt like that was because she had so much pent up frustration and anger. Like that part didn't surprise me. I was surprised that she ended up leaving her son. I didn't anticipate that aspect of the book. I mean, I know she'd had frustration and he was a burden to her, and you know, but I always got the impression that she loved him, and that was like the violence with the candlestick and all that sounds like Clue, was not as surprising to me as her choice to leave and leave and go to Chicago. That really struck me.
There was a line somewhere where she mentions if she left him there, he would be better off. You know, so she would have been like holding him back from any kind of other future. So I feel like she thought she was setting him free somewhat from having this mother who did this thing, like he would never get out of the street.
Yeah, I understand that. I just still, it's a big, you know, that's a big thing.
Yeah.
And really, she could have gotten away with it. I don't know what that says about me as a reader, but if she there's a possibility that she could have gotten away with it and stayed with her son. I think a part of her had a mental break when she found out that her son was in the juvenile hall, because from then on, the first thing she did was run down those stairs, and she never escaped that feeling. If you remember towards the end, when she talks about there's always a presence near her of anxiety, of like this foreboding silence, like that was giving very much mental break to me. And I think that she, at the risk of using modern terminology, she rage quitted. She said, I'm out. She said, I'm done.
Yeah. Well,
And she left.
I think that goes back to what Lucy was pondering too. Like, what was her frame of mind? Where I think she just went to a completely different plane of like thought, reality, and then she didn't know if seeing Junto there, was he the real gray blob? Was he the vision she had saw in her apartment? I think she was just completely, even out after it happened, like there was a red veil over a man's face, like she was, you know, out of just gone in a different place.
Yeah, it seems she just actually reached her breaking point, you know. I mean, and she's trying, it's like what you're saying, Jacob, the minute she found out that Bub was in this reform school, she's kind of like, well, what can I do? And she goes to the beauty parlor, she tries to go to a movie, like she can't do, she's like, nothing's working. Like, it's almost just like her mind just kind of
Mhm.
broke. I mean, I don't know, for lack of a better word, like it was just understandably like all of this, and even when she's like with the candlestick, I think, isn't she kind of like thinking this is for this and this is what, I mean, like she really thinks that one through, for us, almost more so than like, here's why I'm leaving my son behind. And maybe that's why Elizabeth is so surprising. It's like you really get the now that I'm thinking about it, like you really get the play-by-play with her of what's happening with the candlestick and Junto, but then she's like, and I'm leaving my son behind. I mean, but I think maybe because it is the best, she thinks it is the best place for him. I mean, if you think back to his teacher, the teacher that what's her name, Miss Rimmer, like we got her point of view, which was actually really interesting, right? But like that was pretty telling.
That was really hard, and the examples and how horrible, like I wrote down a quote, the smell of the children and their coats and how she would open the windows and not open the windows, and the way she was describing them and how she was like at the train or the bus stop, it was all terrible. But I do think it was an interesting point of view to have mixed in with all of these other like Black voices and their experiences, than to have this one it was she. Oh, Miss Renner, the Sinner.
Yeah.
That was so vivid and hard to read. But I'm also here to say that is 2022.
Mm-hmm.
Oh my God. I think of like students Black male students who are 17 or 18, and they present as adults because they are grown, in the way that I've seen teachers treat those kids, because they're grown, but they're kids, is exactly how that teacher treats the students in that book. That smacked the spit out of my mouth. I was like, oh, whew. How many times have I said, whew?
Well, it's like she already just, I mean, I think because like that, she's an example of that, like that decision ahead of time. Like there's no point in teaching these kids. I'm not going to teach these kids, like, because they're not teachable. And so that sort of leads into that whole, like, so then where are they going to go? Where are they going to be? They're going to be shining shoes. And then they're going to go into the next thing, like into Ludi's worries. But I just think that idea that Miss Rinner was her name. So clearly she's just like, but I don't have anything to do here. Like there's no reason for me to be here. I can't be a teacher here to these. I think she even refers to them as animals in her.
Yeah.
It was like
I was gonna say that. Yeah. Yep. And also, I mean, that's just another aspect of the whole system of oppression that, like, Ludi feels like they can't get out of. She can't get her son out of. Like, like the teacher won't even teach because like of this viewpoint she has. And then, like you said, Lucy, and there's not the education, and like, it just, everyone is held down in this, and oppressed. And it's just like, I thought that was a really useful perspective to show how it starts so early in childhood with schooling or racism or both, or whatever, and all that education. So
yeah,
it's also sort of spookily mirrored, I think, towards the end. Ludi is remembering something that she was told when she was a kid of like, why did I even bother trying to teach you? And she has this moment of saying like, yeah, what has learning brought me? Like, this has done nothing for me, in like this really sad way.
Yeah, maybe she's almost resigned then in a way when her son is in reform school, of like, well, that was your path. And that's like where you were going to end up. So
yeah, didn't she say something
you're
like
where,
that?
yeah, I think she kind of thinks that, like, you're where you're supposed to be, essentially. So now I'm going to go.
It's like something like he would have ended up there anyway.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. Well, one thing we haven't touched on, I did really like, I think just over halfway through the book, you really got to hear the words "the street" and how it was personified in this book. And I love the full paragraphs where the street was referenced into larger than being just the cement block with cars on it. That was just beyond, it just put the nail in the coffin. You just hit it just was so intense. Where she says there's a couple different things about the kids. They should have been playing in wide stretches of green park, and instead they were in the street, and the street reached out and sucked them up. That was after Bub was taken, or only you forgot you were Black and you underestimated the street outside here. Or there was another one, and while you were working to pay the rent on this stinking rotten place, why the street outside played nursemaid to your kid. The street did more than that. It became mother and father and trained your kid for you. And it was an evil father and a vicious mother. And of course, you helped the street along by talking to him about money. So just reading those things and about how, and we said this earlier about how the street was just a larger metaphor for much of the other oppressors and things that are out there. But just the paragraph surrounding when Ludi was having these realizations about how much larger the street was than just outside of the front door of the place she lived. It was just so heavy.
Well, and there's, not to like sound like we're in an English class, but there was like so much true personification of the street, right?
Yeah.
Like actually as a character and as like, you know, I had made a note of like when they were talking about how the snow got blacker and covered with garbage, and it appeared to be some dark eruption from the street itself, kind of a horror element, like Jacob was saying too. Like it's very personified. It's a character in and of itself, not just a location and a place, which I thought was really, really cool writing. I mean, sad, but just beautiful in its way, in its, you know, sad way.
Yeah, she also refers to it as the North's lynch mob at one point. She talks about, she says, streets like the one she lived on were no accident. They were the North's lynch mob. Lynch mob, she thought bitterly, the method the big cities used to keep Negroes in their place. And she began to think of pop. You know, it's like she just, the idea that like that the street has so much power over them, that this street, that's this character, that this yeah, it just, I'm just agreeing with you, like you guys just are what you're saying about the writing about the actual physical space of the street. And then the weather, I think also, like, it's hard to ignore the weather in this book. I mean, just from the first scene, and then like it ends with the snow, and I don't know, I think you could have a whole conversation on the weather.
Yeah, but again, it just goes back to the writing. It was such an interesting writing style. I can't, there's few books I can compare this to, the way the content, but the way it was written and the way the characters were laid out and the different voices you heard, and how like dark and heartbreaking it was, but also how you were compelled to read more to see what other horrors were lying next. But then to also, as you're reading this book in present day, to compare it to things that are still happening today. Yeah, it's just amazing. I think, and I'm really sad that like all five of us sat here and hadn't heard of this book before.
Oh, I heard it.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, I take it back.
No,
Lucy,
that's only because I was like so excited. I wanted to so excited because it's been on my list to read for so long. And I think I was trying to figure out why that was. And I was going back and I realized that there's some other writers that I've read recently, like current writers who have referenced this as like Tari Jones, who wrote An American Marriage. And like, this is a book she teaches every year. And I think she had a big part in, I think she writes the foreword in like in this version, in like bringing it back. But I think so I kept seeing it in these places. I'm like, what is this book? What is this book? What is this book? And so I'm really just glad that that I found out what it is. It's just like you're saying, Amanda, I can't think of something that I've read like this in a long time. I really like loved this book, which also is like would you recommend this book to somebody? You know, yes. I mean, I would, but I'd have to say, but, you know, I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know.
One of my favorite books, and there's, now that we're talking about it, which makes me so thankful for these conversations, that is so much like The Street, but from a completely different perspective, is called The House Next Door by Anne Rivers Siddons. If I've talked to you about this, I'm talking again. I'm so sorry. Yeah.
No, I want to read it. It's on my list because of you. Yeah.
My soapbox is so tall about this book. It is very much a look at society using thriller and horror tropes. In The House Next Door is a representation of the world at large. just in the same way that the street
Mhm.
is a representation of every street.
Mhm.
And it tackles social issues, of course, from a completely different lens, because it's about rich white people in like the 70s and 80s in Charleston. It's like this white woman, like through certain horrors that occur in the house next door, has to unlearn being such a wretched person. There's a lot of similarities, and I could literally scream about them for hours. But anyway,
Thank Jacob. That sounds fascinating. Now I'm excited to look into.
I hope I sold it good.
Yeah. I actually have to duck out, so I just wanted to say thanks, everyone. And also, I would recommend this book to people. I mean, maybe with a caveat, but I thought it was absolutely worth the read. So I just wanted to have that be my last statement and enjoy the last few minutes. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, bye, Elizabeth. And we can pretty much like wrap up, but I also I'm curious to know if you think you will read more Ann Petry. And she has 2 more novels. She has a collection of short stories. She wrote a bunch of essays.
I was interested in her child's biography of Harriet Tubman,
Mhm.
only
Yeah,
because I
sure.
liked her writing style so much, where I said I would love to see
Mhm.
what that's like. I am not ready to pick up The Narrows, which sounds similar to The Street.
Mhm.
I would love to pick it up a few months from now, but I'm not running to the bookshelf to pick up, because I gotta sit with this.
Yeah, it seems hard to top. And I'm curious. I really enjoyed this book a lot, but yeah, it's I need to sit with it for a minute before I try to read anything else by her.
Yeah, and it seems like that and I haven't read and I have not looked up what all of them are or what they are all about. I just read a little bit, and some of the comments were that nothing ever came close to like this book, her first book. I feel like she had so much within her that she witnessed and observed and lived through this, just to put it out in the world. And this was her format. And I do like the fact that she was told, like, as a young person, like, hey, if you want to be a writer, you should be a writer, you know, and she was able to take that gift and then take her personal experiences and what she's gone through and people she's seen go through, and to put it into such a beautiful book. It's amazing how there are some writers who have this debut that just like knocks everyone on their feet, and then they do other books. And it's interesting. It's not a bad thing, but it's interesting. It's almost like they were meant to like have this book like change the world, and then you just can't go back to that. You know what I mean? That's not to say I wouldn't read other things, and it's not to say every debut author puts out a book like that. And some people do write their best book, in some people's opinions, I think as their 5th book or their 3rd book. But for this one, I mean, if this is the whopper, I am curious about some of the stuff that she's written for children, though. So, but I do need to also sit with this one. I just finished it this afternoon, so I'm still just kind of like, you know, feeling the vibes of like the horrific outcome, and like her sitting in Chicago and Bub sitting in that detention center, and just, you know, Boots has blood all over his face. Like, I want to know like who's going to find him and what, you know, the next steps are.
Yeah, I don't know. I plan to read every word she's written. I'm like just so into that. Like I don't know. I loved this book. I was blown away by it. And I read this interview with her daughter, and her daughter's favorite book of hers is actually The Narrows. So, but so I will be the intrepid one here, and I will let you know how they compare. Yeah, I'm just going to do this deep dive into Ann Petry, so I'll report back. So does anyone else have anything that they want to add that we didn't bring up? There's so much in this book that we could have talked about, but.
I just kind of like to pose this question that does not need to be answered, but it's just like, I wonder in what amount of time it sold 1 million copies, and what people, if 1 million people are reading this book, and it's 1940,
Mhm.
like I wonder what part or parts of the book readers of that time connected with and made the book so popular. Because I think the book points its finger at the majority of probably its readership. I could be completely wrong. I am just interested in how popularity kind of fits into this narrative about what the book is and what it stands for and so on and so forth.
You know, I had that thought today, like who were these million purchasers of the book, you know? I would like to know that.
Same thought.
Yeah.
Because I was wondering if this was a book that is sort of like a cathartic read for Black women who have been through similar things, or if this is like out there changing the hearts and minds of like white men. You know what I mean? Like that there's certainly many things between those two, but I'm very curious what.
Yeah, I mean, because I think she gave it like I think she won like it was like a contest or with Houghton Mifflin. Like she gave them some of the book and they were like, yes, write this book. We will publish this book. And I don't think in 1946, I think in 1946, the people working at Houghton Mifflin were most likely white men, but that's just based on what I surmise of the publishing industry, you know. So that it's just, it does. I would love to find a way to find that out, who bought this book. So maybe in my deep dive, I will find out for you. Well, so the next book that we are reading for this series is Swing Time, which is also a novel. It's by Zadie Smith. So that should be a good one. And yeah, thank you all for this really good discussion. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Bye, thank you.